Jackie, BRAVEBOY-WARNER will continue that warming up process. The next set of panels are supposed to begin around 11 o'clock. We'll begin very near to 11 o'clock, believe me. Jackie has promised her full cooperation in this regard. And even if you have to cut your lunch short, I think this intellectual feast is far more exciting and rewarding in the long run. I hope you agree with me there. I don't need to introduce Jackie at all. All I'll say that, you do know that she will soon be formally anointed as our leader, as C.S.A. president. She professes at the City University of New York in political science. She's a recent author, or the author of recent books on interpreting the Third World, the Caribbean in World Affairs, and a new book which will be published within the next few months, The Caribbean and the Pacific Century. Jackie.
This is not supposed to be a discussant situation, but the idea of having me at the end of it all is to somewhat look at some of these issues from the perspective of the policy makers and so on in the Caribbean today. And I have found all the presentations very exciting in this regard, and they all touch on various things that I intended to say in any event. In any event, the 1990s are a very challenging time, clearly, for foreign policy analysts, foreign policy shapers, and some of us who are in some way trying to influence the decision-making system in the Caribbean. Clearly, Hilborn has touched on a lot of the issues, a lot of the changes that have taken place as far as the U.S. is concerned. And I really have one problem with Hilborn's assessment and some other assessments, and that is that we have had a tendency in the Caribbean to constantly overestimate our capabilities vis-a-vis the United States, and at the same time underestimate the resolve of the United States and the power of the United States, the hegemonic power of the United States. And I'll return to that in a little bit. But this is a period of time in which clearly there's a lot of reassessment both in the developed world and in the developing countries, the smaller countries of the world. In the United States, those of us who are based in the United States have been sort of flooded by a barrage of articles and papers and so on, which have been coming out, usually entitled "The U.S. in the New Emerging Order," Western Europe in the New Order, Japan in the New Order, and so on and so forth. Very little on the Third World, although recently we had a series on Africa, the marginalization of Africa in the New Order. And this, of course, reflects the fact that everybody at this point in time is reassessing, all right, trying to decide what to do given the new conditions and the new order which is still supposedly emerging. In the larger countries, I think the focus has been on the reorientation of military strategies. Certainly that Pentagon document which Hilborn referred to was of great interest to all of us, because initially this was leaked to the press, to the New York Times and so on. And initially the Pentagon defined its new role. It's clearly the military is searching for a role in the face of economic financial cutbacks and so on in the United States. And initially it was defined as making sure that no other superpower emerges in the world, no other rival emerges in the world. And that caused quite a bit of furor when it was leaked. And so recently they revised their thinking to be some slightly milder language, but it all amounts to the same thing, that is, that the United States is very much prepared, that the Pentagon anyway hopes that the government would be very much prepared to go in to make sure that the United States remains the strongest power in the world, and to make sure that it takes the lead in resolving conflicts, especially regional conflicts and so on, in the world, and that it gets involved in all areas of strategic interest to the United States. So that has been clearly very important. The fact is that even though we're all reassessing what is happening, we do know that the New World Order contains some basic characteristics. One of these characteristics is the fact that the Soviet Union is no longer around. It clearly is no longer a power, a superpower. It can't be counted out for the future, but right now it's not. And therefore, it is not a counterpoint anymore to the United States for third world states. Russia and its component republics cannot provide aid, cannot provide any tangible support, and I'm afraid in this world, we all have to be extremely realistic and go with the flow as far as looking for financial aid and so on is concerned. The former Soviet model of development has been discredited by the Soviet Union's own dismantling of its command system. That therefore leaves the United States as the only superpower, and whether we look at it from a political economy perspective or a traditional perspective, I think we have to agree that the United States is the strongest power around. And despite the domestic problems that the United States is facing, problems which preclude it from acting alone in world affairs, the United States perspective is predominant in global, political, and economic forums. At the United Nations, all right, clearly there's a recognition that the United States view is predominant, that the Western Europeans are having a consensus of opinion with the United States. And so obviously at the core of the new world order is the perspective of the United States. And that was recently described by Secretary of State Baker, who was trying not to make it look as though the United States wants to be the only power around. And he described it in the following way. As the most powerful democracy on earth, we must act the catalyst, driving forward where we can. As President Bush has said, the world trusts us with power. They trust us to do what's right. Because of this American record, we are able today, if we will, to work with our partners to share responsibilities and costs and to advance together on common problems. That is American leadership through collective engagement. So this seems to be, and this word keeps coming out, this phrase, American leadership through collective engagement. Further, the Secretary said, the idea is to replace the dangerous period of the Cold War with a democratic peace, a peace built on the twin pillars of political and economic freedom, and I think that is the key. That the United States is prepared to act around the world in order to preserve political and to foster political and economic freedom. One of the things though which is not at all clear is that the United States is prepared to act militarily. All right, the Pentagon clearly is trying to push this, but even the Pentagon document notes that U.S. influence strategies are more likely to stress diplomatic and economic tools and multilateral and regional solutions than military instruments, so that we should not expect to see the United States heavily involved militarily around the world. If we look at Western Europe as a counterpoint from the security perspective, Western Europe is attempting to go its own way, and just two days ago, France and Germany announced that they were going to form a force of their own. But again, we don't see there any emergence of a group which would be a counterpoint to the